So we're going to be looking this week at the deeper meaning of Noah and the ark. It is not, I'll say this each time we talk about these ancient stories from early Genesis. These are not literal stories. There was not a Noah, there was not an ark, and God doesn't destroy humanity. God is love. So there's going to be a deeper meaning to it. Let's see if we can get to it, both for what was going on in the world at that time, in the spiritual history of humanity, but also how does it apply to us today. So we'll look at the deeper spiritual meaning today. And the Noah story teaches us how human civilization got started, and it's also important at a personal level, the power of self-awareness. You'll probably remember that if you've been following the series, we talked about the Adam and Eve, we've talked about Cain and Abel, so Noah represents a new evolution in the spiritual mind of humanity, and that's what we're going to be looking into today. So as I do each week, I'm going to give a quick summary. That was a long reading. The story of Noah is many chapters. We didn't even get into all of them. So I'll be referring to some pieces in the story that we didn't read today because it's so long. It's 4 chapters in Genesis. So I'm going to give a quick summary as I do each week. And so let's go through and just refresh ourselves what's going on here. So very strange beginning story. This statue reflects it, that there's sort of this story that there were the sons of God and they liked the daughters of the earth and they married them and they came down and married them. So very mythological and sort of kind of very jarring story. Maybe one of the strangest passages in scripture that I've ever read. So, but that's where it starts, and we go next. And then it says there's this creation of a giant race. Here's a piece of artwork describing it, but they were called the Nephilim, which in Hebrew means the fallen ones. So there's this creation of this giant race. Another very strange piece for the Bible. And then we have the introduction of Noah. God is very angry at humanity, according to the story, is saying, this isn't working out the way I had planned. We're going to have to make some changes. And so he finds a good person in Noah, and it tells him, you better start building an ark. I'm going to flood the earth. And then the flood lasts, it rains for 40 days. If you're living in the DC area today, you can literally feel that experience. We just went through our own little flood here. And so it does rain for 40 days and the ark floats above the flood. And eventually the rain stops and the waters descend a little bit. And to figure out whether they can go to land, Noah puts out 2 different birds. First, a raven that comes back with nothing, and then a dove that comes back with signs that there's life they can live on, and that's a good sign. Just go to the next. And they get out, and there's dry land. They start off on a mountain, and God has a pledge. And the pledge is, as long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will never cease. And there's a rainbow saying, we won't do this again. And Noah builds an altar thanking God for it. Okay, one first very interesting thing. Now I'm going to go into the deeper meaning of it. This story is a part of almost every single civilized society in the world, which is really pretty cosmic. So I'm saying that that's the Babylonians, the Sumerians, the Egyptians, Ovid, Gilgamesh are all stories of a huge flood. A couple of people are saved. God is angry at the world, and so the story. It's in our hemisphere where we live now. The Mayans had a myth. You can see the drawings there of the Mayan myth, and the Native Americans had a myth. So this myth of a flood sweeping the world is in every single culture, practically every civilization in the world. I think that's pretty wild. Let's look at our spiritual meaning of the story that we have, and it came through the Hebrew tradition. So the spiritual meaning is the deeper meaning of the symbols. This is a symbolic story, so we're going to look at what happened and what the symbol represents. And this would be according to Swedenborg's interpretations. So the very weird part that I talked about, this marriage of like the daughters and these gods, it represents a time in the history of humanity when our thoughts and our feelings were not separate, they were united. And so whatever we thought, whatever we felt, we thought, and whatever we thought, we felt, there was no break. We can see that existing in the world right now in babies, in children. Their feelings are their thoughts, and their thoughts are their feelings. There's no rationalizing it. You may at times see adults talk to a baby like they can rationally, like, if you just be quiet right now and take your nap, the child cannot process that. And so it's saying that humanity couldn't process that. We were what we thought and felt, and they were united in the evolution of humanity. And that's the symbolism that's taking place there. And so another strange thing, the Nephilim, the fallen ones, these giants, they represent that when we didn't have this separation, humanity goes in the wrong direction. We've been seeing through the last few studies of Genesis that when humanity seems to go through the cycle pretty regularly, we had the fall out of the garden, we had Cain killing Abel, and now the rise of these giants represents a humanity that was, they refer to them as monsters, the becoming monsters. When we were losing goodness. It represents these creatures, sort of monsters. What it might represent today in our world are people who are completely obsessed with themselves. So like intense narcissism, where everything is about me, me, me. And as we know, those people can become monsters. So that's kind of where humanity was. And because of this inability to reflect outside of whatever it felt. Next slide. So Noah represents a new phase for humanity, a new evolution that happened in human beings, but it happened in our spiritual selves. And it's the separation of thoughts and feelings, something that we sort of take for granted now, but was not true then. And so God calls Noah, tells him to build this ark, and I'll talk a little bit more about the ark, but the ark represents the creation of the human mind and our conscience, and that everybody is given one, no matter where they're raised, whatever their background, no matter how tumultuous their life is. We are all given a mind that can reflect on our feelings, a voice that can say, that's not the right thing to do. We know what's right. So that the ark represents that. And then there's this closing of the door, and that represents that humanity would not have direct access to the divine in the way it had in the past. Interestingly enough, I will just say I've noticed a lot of people lately who seem to have direct access. People call themselves channelers or intuitives. So maybe as we're developing the world, that connection is being reconnected this many years later. But there was a time when that was natural for people, but it was pretty much shut down. Certainly something I don't have. Okay. So the ark represents our mind, our development of conscious. It represents that our conscience means that when we have our flood of doubts, when we have a flood of anxiety, when we have the flood of evil thoughts in our minds, whenever this flood comes, there's a part of us that will always be protected against it, that we're not just at the whims of our feelings, our anxieties, our depression, that there's a part of us that can separate from that, and that's the ark floating through it. It does feel like when we're in those states at a personal level that we're isolated, lost, we can't see any land, we can't see the sun, which, can't see God. We feel very isolated. So we're all going to go through periods of doubt, periods where we'll feel like we are just being cast about by our feelings. But the good news of the ark is that there is a protection, spiritual protection, that God has given us through these situations. And as I mentioned, the flood, it really represents, if you've ever said, God, I felt like a flood of anxiety come over me, or I felt like a flood of feelings I couldn't control, or I feel like a flood of concerns. We are going to all have those periods in our life where we feel like a flood of things will come over us. But the story of the ark is we're not a victim of those. We through God's blessing, we are protected through floods, but they will come to all of us at different times in our life. and we've all experienced them. So the 40 days of rain are symbolic. 40 days in the Bible is a symbol. It's a symbol in, if you recognize it, there's 40, the Israelites traveled for 40 years. Do you remember anybody else in 40 days of temptation? That was Jesus in the desert. So Jesus, the Israelites. So when you see 40 days, it means a period of testing, of temptation. And that's what the 40 days of rain represent in the story. That we are all going to go through periods. Every one of us will go through periods where we'll have trials, temptations, and struggles. It says in the story they couldn't see even the mountains, and they can't see the sky above. There's going to be times when, if you think of the sun as God, the light is there, but we can't see it. There's going to be times below where we don't feel like we're on dry land. We just can't seem to get our bearings. So we feel like we're being rocked and knocked about by life. And that's that time when we feel very isolated during these times. The message spiritually is that the times when we feel the furthest from God, God is closest to us, and angels are closest to us, though we still feel very alone. Okay, and the birds being sent out, what does that represent? This represents that when we're coming through a period of trial or temptation or struggle, we still aren't sure. We're not clear with our messages. We often just say, I wish God would just speak directly to me, but we can't. So the raven represents still some confusion, and the dove represents we're getting a clear message, we're getting on track. But it's a process. The dry land that Noah steps out onto represents in our lives when we come through trials, we come through struggles, there's that moment where we're like, I've arrived. I can feel a sense of peace. I can feel my feet again. I can feel like I'm safe. That's what we're all, after we go through these periods of trials, which will be natural, there will be this time of just resting in peace. And we'll be at a new level of spiritual growth. We cannot grow spiritually without challenges and these trial periods. We grow through them. And then at the end, there's that pledge that I said that was about the cold and the heat and the harvest and the winter and night. What this represents is that none of us ever arrive spiritually at a point where we stop growing, that our life will be a series of cycles. And even though today we might feel very close to God, there will be a period where we could feel very distant and lonely and depressed. There are other times when we feel distant, lonely, and depressed, and it's very hard for us to even remember that God is connected to us. We don't feel anything connected to us. We don't feel connected to even our friends or family. So we can go through periods of night, darkness, cold, heat, and these cycles will continue through our life. We don't arrive at a plateau and say, I'm here, I'm spiritually arrived, and I'm done. Our life will be a continual cycle of challenges. The rainbow, though, represents the fact that it's very scientific in a way. The light is shining through the clouds, represents the rainbow. The clouds would be our doubts, our inability to see things clearly. It doesn't mean the light is not on the other side. It doesn't mean God isn't there. We just can't see it, but God can shine through. And in those moments, we call them epiphanies or spiritual enlightenment or, oh my gosh, I was so close to God. We can have these really highs when we get the sign of the rainbow in our life. It's a beautiful connection and a reminder God is always with us. And yeah, the rainbow, God's love shines through. So the spiritual psychology of the story is that every human, no matter what their situation, is given a conscience, and we have the knowledge of doing good or evil, so we know it. And when we do evil or we do the wrong things, we're aware of it. It's not a shock. We could be distant from it, we can rationalize it, but there is a voice that says, you shouldn't do that. And we still do, constantly struggle with that. We know what's right and we know what's wrong. And then, again, it's no matter what our background. And part of us is protected and safe in this ark, no matter what life's turmoil. And we can turn to our conscience and we can turn to what we know is right. Overall, the message is that God is with us in challenging times. These challenging times are necessary for our spiritual growth. A lot of people say, wow, I I feel like I'm always struggling, or I don't feel like I've arrived. That would be the nature of a person who's growing. The story of Noah is that we became self-aware. We now can look at our life. Self-awareness is the beginning of all good spiritual practice and life. If we are not self-aware, we can't grow because we can't critique ourselves. We can't see what has to change. But being self-aware, having that something separate from our emotions and how we feel, when we can actually step out of ourselves and reflect on ourselves and say, that's not good. The way I did that was not right. That's the way we grow a spiritual life. Overall, the story of Noah is that God is with us through good times and in bad times. But when we feel at the least connected, God is the closest. And that is the psychological spiritual story of this very powerful story that transcends all cultures in the world. Amen.